Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another enlightening episode of Let's Talk Inclusion. It's our 64th episode. I'm your host, Manobina Chakraborty, and today I'm joined by a distinguished guest, Dr. Martin Bloomfield, a trailblazer in the realm where artificial intelligence intersects with neurodiversity. Hello, Martin, welcome.
Hello,
So,
and thank you for a lovely introduction. That was lovely.
Thank you, Martin. So, before we embark on our exploration into the fascinating world of AI and neurodiversity, I would love for our viewers to get to know you a bit better. Martin, could you share with us a glimpse into your life and the work you do?
Wow. So there's a phrase in England that you might know called the gig economy. And the gig economy is generally associated with people who deliver Uber Eats and drive Uber cars and Bolt cars and things. Um, Essentially, it's people who do lots of different jobs at the same time. I'm a member of the gig economy, so I work for a university in Berlin. I work for a university in Bavaria. I do work for a university in France most years. I run a project called Dyslexia Bites, which looks at dyslexia from an intercultural perspective, where I deliver training and consultancy and keynotes in dyslexia awareness. I'm a director of an organization called Beyond Inclusion, where
Yeah,
we
I
help
know.
schools become more and more inclusive with some excellent colleagues, Sandra Tibbles and Victoria Rayner, really good people. And I'm the director, or the trustee rather, of something called the Accessible Learning Foundation in Britain. And oh, by the way,
So
I forgot,
nice.
I'm also the editor-in-chief of an online academic journal focusing on neurodiversity called
Okay,
Neuroconverse.
exactly. And you are a distinguished fellow of IFIP. I know.
Distinguished Fellow of the IFIP run by Daniel Sobel. So yeah, that's been an honor to have been accepted as that as well, very much.
Thank you for sharing, Martin. Your dedication and passion are truly inspiring. And a lot have been spoken about AI these days. What I wanted to ask you, Martin, is that how is AI currently being used to enhance the lives of neurodiverse individuals?
Yeah, so I think one of the things to say before we answer this is to just have a very quick understanding of what we mean by AI. So AI
Ex-
usually involves what we call machine learning, neural networks, natural language processing. So essentially, um, AI uses machines to learn by, if you like, harvesting data, basically, and then to predict what will come next um, with what they call natural language. That is trying to sound as human as possible. Uh, Essentially, what happens is when you talk to Chat GPT, for instance, what it's doing is it's predicting the words that's most likely to happen next. And for a
Yes.
more sophisticated version, it'll predict all sorts of things that might come further down the line. And then it gives you natural language. That is, it tries to sound as human as possible. It doesn't always work very well. Something AI isn't. So if you look at your smart TV or your smartphone, it's smart, but not because of artificial intelligence. It's smart because of other things. Artificial intelligence might be in there, and in the later models, it generally is in there. But originally, smart TVs, smartphones, etc., were smart, but not for AI reasons. So just to distinguish that. With for instance, neurodiversity, there's an awful lot of digital technology that isn't AI. So, for instance, screen readers, text to speech, speech to text, these kinds of things, these generally speaking don't require artificial intelligence. But what you have is you've got things like ChatGPT and other similar products, other products also available. You've got things like ChatGPT, which allow those of us with dyslexia, for instance, to be able to create papers or essays at school without having to put in the literacy legwork, so to speak. The question then becomes, of course, what's the balancing line between allowing people to use this, which we should, by the way, for all sorts of reasons, and then guiding people in how to use it intelligently. So don't just let the artificial intelligence be intelligent. The humans have got to be intelligent in how they use it and what they do with it. And so this is the basic understanding of where we are with artificial intelligence.
Yeah, exactly. Um, can you share?
I'm not. I hope I did, but
Yeah,
hope,
sorry.
did I answer your question? By the way,
Yes, you did. More or less, you did, of course.
more or less.
So, can you share a successful case where AI significantly improved outcomes for a neurodivergent person or community?
Yeah, so I mean, a very, very simple example is one that I use myself. So I use an artificial intelligence search function for academic papers, and it's called Elicit,
Okay.
Elicit, I think. I'd have to write that down to check, but Elicit. And what it does is it allows me to search for academic papers that deal with particular topics I'm interested in. It sorts these and it ranks them, it prioritizes them in the most relevant and the most useful. It summarizes
Mhm.
them, and essentially it acts as a personal assistant. It predicts what I want, and it acts as a personal assistant so that I don't have to read through thousands and thousands, well, dozens maybe, of academic papers trying to find the information that I want. I type into this program, this is what I'm looking for, and it brings me the information that I want. So what it's not doing is it's not doing any academic work for me. It's doing the legwork for me. And that's where
Yeah.
artificial intelligence can really, really help. And it's a great way of using artificial intelligence. What it can also do is it can take what we've already written. Let's say let's take dyslexia or ADHD. It can take what we've already written and it can smooth
Mhm.
out the edges so that it knows what we would want to write. It knows what we're trying to write. And it just basically makes what we've written slightly more intelligible. Where perhaps if you have dyslexia or ADHD, you might have executive function issues, and it may be slightly difficult to get it down correctly on paper. So that's what artificial intelligence can do, and it can do it very well indeed.
Yeah. Caroline was guest last week. Caroline from
Oh, lovely.
UK. Okay. Are these sites, AI sites, meant for neurodivergent people, or it's for everybody? We're
Well,
talking about.
they're meant for everybody. But
Okay.
this is the problem, that although they might be meant for everybody, they don't reach everybody. So I think
Mhm.
only something like 40%, in fact, less than 40% of primary schools in the world have got access to the internet. And generally speaking, you need access to the internet to be able to access artificial intelligence. You don't have to, but most of the time for the
Yeah.
things we need at school. And so what they're not accessing the lower socioeconomic demographics. That's one of the
Mhm.
things. There are also something else which is important is the psychological barriers. So there are psychological barriers to accessing AI. I'll take my mother as an example. My mother she's dyslexic, but not very dyslexic. But she's 83, which is far more relevant. And she doesn't even
Yeah.
like using smartphones. She doesn't want to use a smartphone because it's too much like hard work and it's a bit frightening for her.
Mhm.
And in a way, I'm the same. I have a friend, very good friend called Susie. And Susie works. She's doing a degree in criminology at the moment. She works. She's worked for Dyslexia Scotland, Susie Taylor, and she keeps telling me about great assistive technology. And I always say, yeah, of course. But the thought of having to learn something else in order to do what I already do is overwhelming and a little bit off-putting. So generally speaking, there's a cognitive barrier. That is that there's almost like a I don't want this barrier to using all new technology. And it's only when it's factored naturally into what we already use that it becomes natural for most people. There's another issue, by the way. Is it available to everybody? Yes, it is, but that doesn't mean it's appropriate to everybody. So here's a really interesting issue with artificial intelligence. Most artificial intelligence is it uses data, okay, and it eats data. That's what it does. But the data that it uses generally is drawn from unrepresentative sources. So the vast majority of the data that it uses comes from North America, comes from Europe, a little bit from Australia, and it tends to come at the same time from particular demographics within these sources, within these countries. And so what it's doing is it's taking a very small worldview that may or may not be appropriate to, let's say, Pakistan or India or Dubai or Sri Lanka or sub-Saharan Africa. And so that's one thing it's doing. At the same time, it's being programmed almost overwhelmingly by people in Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley is almost overwhelmingly taken from a very small number of Ivy League wealthy, predominantly white middle-class American students with accompanying Ivy League wealthy, predominantly white middle-class interests, aims, purposes, and worldviews. And so on the one hand, technically AI is universally available, but in reality it isn't universally available. And at the same time, the people who are programming the AI are drawing the information from a relatively small contingent of the world. And the people who are programming AI are themselves from a very small contingent of the world with very limited worldviews. And I'm not criticizing them for that. We all have limited worldviews. But in order to have a wider worldview, we need to connect far more people together.
Yeah. And do you think this is an obstacle for AI developers uh, they face when creating tools for different users of different abilities?
So that's a really great question. On the one hand, it's not an obstacle for AI developers at all. They can go merrily along their way developing something that's quite limited, and they'll be happy, But is it an obstacle for developers in creating something that's inclusive, that's universal, that's available for everybody, and that's always appropriate for everybody? It's a huge obstacle. And what you'll find is that, already there have been studies and significant studies showing the gender and ethnicity bias that have been that's been factored into the AI algorithms. So it learns the prejudices of the people it learns from. We all learn the prejudices of the people we learn from, but you have AI who essentially it eats up data from particular streams, and then it eats up more data that corroborates that data. And so essentially the prejudices become exponentially corroborated. And so we already know that AI believes that criminals are generally black and brown skinned. We already know that AI believes that higher socioeconomic demographics are white and male. Lower socioeconomic demographics are female, black, and brown skinned. Again, we know that, and this is shocking, by the way. This is really shocking. We know that AI has a view of what it is to be human. Now, this is really interesting. AI's view of what it is to be human is essentially white and male. It recognizes white male faces as human far more than it recognizes, let's say, female, black-skinned, disabled trans people as human. It wouldn't recognize those as human nearly as well as it would recognize me as human. So let's say, for the sake of the argument, AI was given a choice of save one person in the world, and it has to save the human being, and it's given your face and my face. Well, goodbye, Manobina. I'm afraid you don't qualify. And that, quite frankly, is quite horrifying if we think of it like that. A colleague of mine, a lady called Professor Claudia Lemke, and a couple of other people, a guy called Niels Florian, and a few others, we've been embarking on a discussion of, okay, so we know from the research that AI has a prejudicial view of race and gender. We know this because it takes the prejudices of the people who program it and the prejudices of the information that it harvests. And by the way, this information itself is kept in rather dark ways. So please, when you go to a website, please do take care to disable cookies if you can. We know that AI has a prejudicial view of gender and of race. We know that, and of sex, by the way, if we want to distinguish gender and sex. So Professor Lemker and I decided, well, what about more hidden differences? What about more hidden minorities, such as neurominorities? That is, people like dyslexia, dyslexics, autistic people, those with ADHD. Does it have an ingrained inherent bias against us? Now, what I'd like to do, if it's okay, is I'd like to share my screen and just show you something.
Yeah.
This is really interesting. So I think I'm able to share my screen. Share screen. There we go. Let's have a look. Select window, and I'm afraid it's going to be the entire screen. So you're going to see what's on my computer anyway. Here we go. Now, hopefully, you'll be able to see this image. This was a very early iteration of the research we were doing, but on the right, we just typed in manager, and on the left, we typed in dyslexic manager. And you can see the difference between the manager and the dyslexic manager. You can see the difference in how AI generated an image. This is generative AI. It's stable diffusion, by the way. So you can see what's happened when we did that. That when we just typed in the word manager, we got a man, white man, probably in his 30s, looking quite cool, quite competent, quite attractive in many ways. Then we typed in dyslexic manager, and we got the same socioeconomic demographic. We got the same white male around about the same age, but looking horrified, confused, and out of his depth because he's dyslexic. Now, this is what AI is doing. Why is this interesting? Well, I mean, on the one hand, it's just interesting. Let's be honest. But there are more interesting things involved in that. So one of the things that we know is that if as teachers, we are using AI to create learning materials for our students, and AI is identifying different students as different neurotypes, then it will create different types and levels of learning material so that the dyslexic students, and let's say the autistic students, ADHD students, will be disadvantaged. And the chances are this will then create a wider inequality in educational outcomes. If you're using, as is already happening, if you're using AI in HR and recruitment processes to sift out people and to decide who goes where, then if anybody is known to be dyslexic, they are not going to be trusted because they're out of their depth in management positions. Whereas non-dyslexic people are not out of their depth in management positions. And so what's happening is we're creating an ever-widening socio-economic gap. And this creates at the same time something which, one of my favorite concepts at the moment, popularized by a very, very good British philosopher called Miranda Fricker, something called epistemic injustice, the idea that some people's opinions are taken more seriously than other people's opinions. To give an example of epistemic injustice, anybody who's watching this, let's assume that there are people watching this, and some of them are women. I'd like the women just to ask themselves, have you ever felt that you haven't been taken seriously because you're a woman in a social situation? And if any of you has, that's an example of epistemic injustice. People don't take you seriously, and there's an ethical injustice there. Well, the same thing is something that we're creating using AI. We're creating this against those with dyslexia, those with autism, and those with ADHD. So there's a time bomb ticking, to be honest with you.
So I'm sure some of our viewers are women as well. Would you like to share your opinion about it in the comment box, please? And also, if you have any questions, you are free to ask us. Okay. And that means this AI developers also need a EDI team to work with, I'm sure.
They
Right?
do. They do. Yeah. So one of the things, I mean, the reason that Claudia and I are working together on this is that we both work in Berlin, a university in Berlin, on
Mhm.
digitalization and digital transformation. And I run the ethics aspect of this. So I run an ethics course on digital transformation, the ethics of digital transformation. And Claudia knows more about digital
Mhm.
transformation than I do, although I'm slowly catching up. And I know a little bit more about ethics than she does, although she's quickly catching up. and and so we decided to team up and join forces on this.
So nice.
IFIP, whom you mentioned earlier, recently hosted an extraordinary event in the UNESCO headquarters in Paris, which is where
Yeah, where we
Manobina
met,
was.
where you and I
Yeah,
met.
yeah. And I attended a think tank in this,
Yeah.
along with Claudia. Actually, she was there with me, and there was a gentleman there representing what I believe was advertised as the world's largest AI education platform, talking about harvesting the data of vulnerable children in order to create better AI education. And this is I mean, this was, to me, this is horrifying. You know, to harvest the data of vulnerable children to use to feed into your AI sort of algorithms is quite a horrifying thing in the first place. Once you've got that far, the next level was that once we've got this data, once we know where people struggle, which is fair enough, there's nothing wrong with knowing where people struggle. But once we know where people struggle, we can help get them up to the standards. Now, one of the
Yeah.
difficulties with this is that these standards are themselves neuronormative. That is, the standards we're trying to get autistic kids up to are neuronormative standards. That's not the standards that the autistic kids themselves might want to get up to. I was talking to somebody yesterday, actually, about ABA, advanced behavior analysis. This a, a therapy technique, let's say, that autistic kids are often put through. And very few people in the neurodiversity field are particularly supportive of it, although some people are. And there's some data to suggest that it's helpful, and there's a lot of data to suggest that it's not helpful. And one of the papers I was discussing with this lady was one that said even those research studies that show that it's helpful are saying it's helpful to get autistic kids up to a standard. But that standard is not the standard that the autistic kids have set. That's the standard that the neurotypical people have set. And so what's happening is already you get neuronormative standards being set for neurodivergent kids. And
Yeah.
it's not necessarily the standards that the kids themselves feel appropriate for themselves. So there's a kind of imposition. There's an ethical imposition going on here.
Yeah, very, very true. So, do you think that uh, it should be ensured that AI solutions are developed with input and feedback from neurodiverse individuals in all cases?
100%. So what we need to do is for the development of AI, and this is one of the things that I work on in Berlin. For the development of AI, we need to ensure that those who are developing AI have got a broad worldview. They
Yeah,
have this broad worldview. They understand what's going on in the world. They need to
exactly.
understand different ethical positions. They need to know about different neurominorities. They need to understand not only do they need to understand, for instance, um, conversations that happen around gender, but they need to understand conversations that happen around gender in different cultural contexts. So, for instance, in some cultural contexts, there are conversations around gender binaries and non-binaries, which are background conversations that don't impact very much on the cultural zeitgeist, and that people don't have much of an issue with. In some cultures, there are these same conversations that happen that have a far greater impact, and that people are very positive about. In other cultures, people are very negative about them. In some cultures, the conversation hasn't been decided yet, and there's what you
Yeah.
might call an internal war going on around this. Well, we can't just take our own concepts and say, well, okay, we come from a culture where, let's say for the sake of the argument, transgender people are considered as non-controversial, let's say. Let's just say for the sake of the argument, and then impose that onto cultures where that's just not the case. We can't do that
Yeah.
unless unless we're going to go back to the grand old days of the British Empire.
It should be culture specific.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And as I said, I mean, I work with Sandra and Vic with this company called Beyond Inclusion. And one of the
Yeah.
things we're really keen about is this cultural sensitivity about helping schools become inclusive, because it's not the job of those of us in the West to tell other people what our understanding of inclusivity is. It's simply inappropriate for us to do that. It's partly our job to listen and to learn, and to make sure that the conversation is an ongoing, sensitive and intelligent conversation that's focused on the well-being of the kids that we're dealing with. What we find with AI, that's not happening.
Okay. Fine. And the ethical concerns, you were talking about ethical side as well. So what are the ethical concerns you encountered in your work
Well,
with AI and neurodiversity?
I mean, so there are two different ways of answering that. One way is answering it by listing a few of the ethical concerns, and the ethical concerns such as, for instance, data harvesting and data storage. How ethical is it to harvest data from, let's say, autistic children? Some autistic children might have very pervasive autism. They may not have the ability to articulate whether they're happy for this to happen, and therefore to take their data without their express consent is ethically we're on eggshells, let's say. It's not obviously an ethical thing to do. And questions such as we say, imposing our own ethical norms onto other cultures. The other way of looking at ethical concerns is to ask a far more fundamental question, which is one of the places I always begin when I run ethics courses, which is to ask the question, what do you mean when you say that something is ethical or unethical? So very, very quickly, I often begin with a very simple statement. Murder is unethical. Almost everybody agrees with this statement. Murder is unethical. And then you say to people, and I'll often produce a list of options. And I say, okay, so what do we mean when we say murder is unethical? Do we mean it is a fact that murder is unethical? Do we mean we have a duty to not murder? Do we mean we think that murder is if you're like, on the whole, a bad thing for society? Do you mean if you murder somebody, then that might give them license to murder me? What is it we're saying when we say that murder is unethical? What we find is that different people actually are saying slightly different things. And some of these things are not compatible. And so one of the things we need to do is we need to understand what I call, not what I call, what philosophers call the ethical framework within which we're operating. And so you can have, for instance, what you might call objectivist ethical frameworks, those people who believe that ethics comes from God, or those people who believe that we have fundamental and inalienable human rights, or those people who think we have duties to society. These generally speaking can be grouped as objectivist ethical frameworks. Then you can have, for instance, consequentialist ethical frameworks. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, that kind of thing. Or happiness is ethically better than unhappiness. These types of hedonism and altruism frameworks. depending on who you are, you may be operating from different ethical frameworks. Interestingly, these ethics are what we call values, and a man called Christian Welzel and who's the other chap? Inglehart created a world values map that's constantly updating, and it shows you different value sets around the world. And you can almost map these ethical concerns onto these world value sets. And you can see that if we begin with a Western view of what it is to be ethical, not everybody in the world shares that view. Now, especially in the modern Western world, where we are pluralizing through levels of immigration, for instance. And then once you have immigration where immigrant communities are expanding within certain areas of cities and not within certain areas of other cities, you find that the makeup of a nation's own ethical perspective starts to change. Nothing wrong with that, nothing wrong with it at all. But what we need to do is we need to understand it, and we need to find ways of opening ourselves up to it. Because we have to be, to some extent, pluralist. And this is where it gets difficult, because as I say to people, we are all pluralist until it gets difficult. Because there's always something I don't want to be pluralist about. I don't want to be pluralist about this particular way of treating women, or this particular way of treating homosexual people. I don't want to be pluralist about that. I want to be quite strict about this. And so one of the things we have to do is understand where our limits of pluralism are, and why they are our limits of pluralism, and what we can do to communicate with those who don't share our viewpoints.
Yeah, the principles of fairness and respect. That's what I think we should
Oh, I'm sorry, Manobina, you were talking. And
keep in mind while... sorry. It's okay. You want to show something, Martin?
No. I was just saying that as you were talking, you broke up, and I could you repeat that?
All right.
Fairness and respect.
All right. I was we were talking about ethics and all, and what I said is that the principles of fairness and respect. I believe that this thing we must keep in mind while developing an AI tool for anybody, for that matter, not only neurodiverse population, but for everybody. What is your opinion about it?
I mean, I agree, but I'm going to slightly challenge at least one of those aspects, which is that fairness, again, is one of these really interesting concepts that different groups may find they disagree about.
Yeah.
So, first of all, not everybody prioritizes fairness in the way that we generally do. They don't always understand fairness in the way that everybody else understands fairness. I mean, a very simplistic, and forgive me for how simplistic this is, but we've all seen the cartoon of the three people standing on boxes trying to look over a fence at a baseball game. And one of them is, it's equity versus equality. And actually it's in itself, it's a really interesting visualization, because it's not as clear as it tries to say that it is. But at the very least, what it does is it says, okay, within fairness, are we going for equality? Are we going for equity? Is there a difference? Some people may talk about equality of opportunity or equality of outcome as equality versus equity. And what is the outcome? So with all consequentialist views, and by the way, equity is a consequentialist view, with all consequentialist views, one of the big questions we have to ask is, well, what is the consequence that we're looking for? So for instance, if I turn the tap on to run a bath, is the consequence that and I forget about it, is the consequence that the bath runs over? Is the consequence that the floorboards upstairs become rotten? Is the consequence that the house loses its value? Is the consequence that my marriage breaks up because the house has lost its value? Is the consequence that that my best friend becomes happy because he then gets together with my ex-wife. Is that the consequence? So one of the interesting questions we have to ask, odd example, but one of the interesting questions we might want to ask is, what do we mean by the consequence or the outcome? So if we talk about equality of outcome, well, what is this outcome? How many outcomes are there? Is there an end point to the outcome? And how do we measure the ethics of that outcome? Do we measure the ethics of that outcome? And again, another consequentialist way, because if you do that, then you're going to go on and on and on forever, and you'll never have your answer. So
Yeah,
it's a fascinating question. But I mean, overall, it does show that when we talk about fairness, it's not always obvious that everybody means quite the same thing by fairness. Here's a great example. I was talking to some people from, forgive me if I get this wrong, I think it was Kuwait. It might have been Qatar, but it could have been Kuwait.
yeah,
About
Qatar, yeah.
about fairness between the sexes. And in Britain, the view of fairness between the sexes might be very different from their view. But when you listen to people saying, oh no, that we're being fair because, you think, yes, you are. If you look at it from that perspective, you're not if you're looking at it from this perspective, and vice versa. And there's no absolute right in this. It's all about listening to people and learning from people and trying to, as it were, trying to form a universal view that in the formation of this universal view does not involve unpleasant power dynamics, because all conversations have power dynamics in them, absolutely all of them.
Yeah.
So how do we walk that line, and how do we navigate that particular minefield? Taking us back to artificial intelligence, that's exactly what AI is doing. AI is universalizing access to knowledge, but it's doing it from a particular perspective that's filled with particular power dynamics.
Exactly. So, and what about AI in the workplace? Workplace inclusivity. Do you think that AI improves workplace inclusivity and support for neurodiverse employees in particular?
Well, generally speaking, yes, because what it can do, I mean, there are different levels of answer here. So on the one hand, what it can do, and it can do this very, very well indeed, is it can smooth out the difficulties that those of us with neurodiversity have. So it can act as something that smooths out the difficulties that, let's say, I'm dyslexic and I have ADHD. It can smooth out the problems that those of us with dyslexia have. It allows me to do my work faster. It allows me to write faster, and make fewer mistakes, and then have to do less proofreading, etc., etc., etc. But unless, and this isn't necessarily an inherent problem with AI itself, but it's an inherent problem with the way that we create AI. Unless we are mindful of how we create AI, who we create it with in mind, then let's say you have people on the autism spectrum who don't have neurotypical facial gestures. They don't have neurotypical social cues. They don't read social cues in the same way that non-autistics read social cues, and they don't give social cues in the same way that non-autistics give social cues. Well, let's say that AI is trying to read social cues, and it's being programmed by people who haven't factored autism into their thinking. Well, suddenly it's prejudicing against autistic workers, because let's say that there's a meeting, and AI is controlling the meeting, and it wants to read the body language, and it wants to read the facial expressions of people in the meeting to decide on the positivity that particular ideas have. It won't be reading autistic body language and autistic social cues and facial cues the same way that it reads other people's body language. Now, statistically, this might not make a massive difference, but on a human level, it makes a huge difference, because what it's doing is excluding autistics from the conversation. It's it's devaluing their contributions to the conversation. And in fact, it's dismissing their contributions to the conversation because it doesn't understand it. It doesn't understand these contributions. It misreads the contributions. It believes that the autistic contributions themselves are wrong, whereas actually its own learning algorithms are wrong.
Yeah.
Other things, as I say, you've got an HR department within a large company. And I'm usually quite open about my dyslexia. Well, that HR department is using AI to help sort out people for promotion, for fast stream promotion, for all sorts of things. And we've already seen what AI believes a manager to look like and what AI believes a dyslexic manager to look like. And it doesn't want the dyslexic manager. No one does. No one wants the manager that looks like that. You know, that looks like essentially a human version of Munch's The Scream. No one wants that. And what we'll find, by the way, is, and I don't want to give too much away about the paper that I'm writing with Claudia, but what it finds is that it believes that dyslexics are happier in lower paid jobs. Let's put it like that. And therefore, if we have AI operative within our HR systems, which we do and will, and we're not programming the algorithms to learn in a sensitive way, and we're not giving it the data that it needs to have, and the data we're giving it is prejudicial, then what we find is that those of us with neurodivergent modalities, those of us with different neurotypes, we will be disadvantaged. And so on the one hand, yeah, it can help, but on the other hand, it can disadvantage. Think of it as think of AI as somebody who is well-meaning, but who has implicit bias. And that's most of us. And so if you like people who are programming AI, they're well-meaning, but a lot of them are quite techie. And they're not really focused on the ethics. Very few of them know anything about ethics, by the way. The years I've been teaching ethics in AI, very few programmers know anything about ethics. They don't even think of it in terms of an ethical thing. They think of it, in terms of a technological challenge rather than a socio-ethical challenge. So very few people think of it in ethical terms. They may be very good people. In fact, I'm going to assume that everybody is a very good person, but they don't think of it in ethical ways, and they will have neuronormative biases because that's what we all have. And so we need to be careful.
Yeah, very true. And there's a privacy-related question in my mind as well. How do you ensure the privacy and security of data collected from neurodiverse individuals using AI tools? It's for everybody, not only neurodiverse people. It's for everybody, though.
It's such a big question, and you can't. So something that's really interesting, I've been working with Autism Europe, Help Autism in Romania, an organization called PAGS in Spain, and Synapsis, an autism-focused organization called Synapsis in Poland. And and we've been running a project about how to help autistic job seekers secure fulfilling long-term stable employment that is fulfilling. This is the important thing, not just get people into jobs, but fulfilling work. And we conducted a series of questionnaires and study groups and sort of round tables around Europe. And one of the things that struck me, and it came out very, very strongly actually, one of the things that really struck me is that on the one hand, managers, generally speaking, would love to know if their employees are autistic. They would love to know that because they want to be able to do something about it. Managers are good people, generally, not all of them. We've all had poor managers, but generally speaking, most people are good people and they want to know and they want to help. On the other hand, autistic job seekers are scared to give this information because they don't know what will happen to it. Now, as soon as you've got AI in the mix, then we kind of do know what happens to the information. That information is eaten up, it's stored in places that very few people know where it's stored, by the way. And then it's
Exactly.
used.
Where is it stored, by the way?
Oh, well, generally speaking, there's a large American organization that is banned in certain countries in the world, but it's got a very big hand in the British Defense Ministry of Defense. It's got a very big hand in the British National Health System. It's got a very big hand in India and China. It's got fingers in many powerful pies, and it's considered to be one of the most unethical organizations in the world. I'm not going to mention it because they'll come for me, but it's stored generally in one or two large organizations. There's an organization that people in Britain will have heard of. These are not probably the people who are storing the information, by the way, but you can understand the British people will kind of have an idea of the ethics involved when they hear the name Cambridge Analytica. There is a connection between these companies, and so yeah, it's stored by people whose ethics are questionable. What do they do with this? Who do they sell it to? Why are they selling it? I mean, if you say, for instance, to a company, oh, this company says, I won't sell your information, that's fine. The company won't, but they're not the ones storing the information. And it's the people storing the information we've got to be careful with, because they're creating large models of what the population looks like. And they're using these large models to sell defense weapons and all sorts of things. There's nothing you can do about it either. It's already there. I'm sorry. It's terrifying, isn't it?
Yeah, we actually need to take robust privacy measures to foster a safe and supportive environment. That is very important. And since it is, we are at the initial phase, I suppose. So maybe later on it will improve. We can just hope for the best.
It will. And if I can just say this is why we have to have these conversations. And Manobina, thank you for this conversation. So I remember again in Paris, the one of the questions was, well, can we have a conversation about this? And there was a particular schools group saying, no, let's just do this. It's great. Let's dive in. And this idea of diving in without considering it ethically is terrifying, to be honest with you, because there are people it will disadvantage. So we need to have these conversations now. And conversations like this are so important, not because perhaps we are here to change the world ourselves, but because the more conversations that we have now, the greater the awareness we can raise. And the greater the awareness that we raise, the bigger the issue becomes. And we already know that most of those people involved in producing AI-powered tools, whatever they are, people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, and we already know that they are starting to think, oh, this is a bit dodgy. They're starting to get a little bit scared of what might happen. Now, they're getting a little bit scared, perhaps for the different reasons. They're thinking in terms of Terminator Judgment Day, with robots coming and destroying us. That's way down the line. That's way down the line. But I'll tell you what, if we don't deal with this issue now, when the robots come for us, they'll come for the neurodivergent people first. They'll come for the non-binary people first. They'll come for the women first. They'll come for the black and brown skinned people first, because these are not looked upon as humans quite as much as white males are looked upon as humans. So we have to have this conversation now.
Yeah. And we must have these conversations every now and then, quite often. We must have this conversation. Now, looking to the future, what innovations in AI do you believe will have the most profound impact on the neurodiverse community?
Well, so many of you may know of an organization called Made by Dyslexia. Made by Dyslexia is a great campaigning organization. what they do is they present dyslexia as a wonderful set of skills and talents and superpowers, which is perhaps a little bit one-sided, let's say. But at least, it's redressing the balance. So recently in Britain, we had a new definition of dyslexia given called the Delphi definition of dyslexia, which uses the word difficulties 4 times. It uses the word weak. It uses the word problem. It uses the word, disorder. It's very negative language about dyslexia. So it's useful that we have positive language about dyslexia as well. Well, they've conducted some research along with EY, who used to be called Ernst and Young, and they found that the skills that have been valued in the late 20th century, skills such as literacy skills, skills such as the ability to organize things in traditional ways. These skills are actually being taken by the machines. They're being taken by digital technology, by artificial intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And the skills that managers want in the future are typically skills such as interpersonal communication skills, creativity, thought leadership. Now, on the one hand, these are skills which are really, really suited to the way that dyslexic people think. And there's tons of studies to show that, by the way. I'm not just being kind to dyslexics. And so what you'll find is that one of the things that AI and all digital technology, because it's becoming very much linked, AI and digitalization are merging at a very quick rate. One of the things that AI and digitalization is doing is it's removing the pressures that those of us with dyslexia have traditionally felt in the workplace. And it's allowing us to highlight and to amplify those skills that we have. Now, some of the skills that EY identified are not traditionally associated with skills that, for instance, autistic people may have. So things like interpersonal communication. It's not that autistic people don't have interpersonal communication skills, by the way. It's that they don't share the traditional norms of interpersonal communication skills.
Yeah,
those traditional norms that generally people are talking about. So one of the things we need to do as a society is we need to allow those of us who've been freed from the shackles of the literacy, if you like, the literacy prison, those of us who've been freed from the shackles of the reading and writing prison, to be able to highlight the skills that we have. All of us, dyslexic, autistic, ADHD, people with Tourette's, people with all sorts of neurodivergent modalities. We need to be able to highlight these now. AI is enabling us to do that. It really is enabling us to do that. At the same time, in school tests, school is really interesting. Schools, generally speaking, are extremely slow to change. And there are practical and political reasons for that. One of the practical reasons that they're extremely slow to change is that they have embedded practices that have worked well enough for 300 years. There are those of us who were collateral damage, and I was one of the kids who failed everything at school, and it was damaging. But generally speaking, schools have worked the way they've worked for about 300 years, and it's these are embedded practices, and it's difficult to change. The political aspect, of course, is that every single government, I mean, we're in the middle in Britain, we're in the middle of a general election campaign at the moment. And in America, they'll be in the middle of an election campaign very shortly. I think India's just come out of an election campaign. Yeah. And what you find with all election campaigns is that when appealing to the populace, the government wants to say, we have great education. Rishi Sunak a couple of days ago was saying that Britain's literacy is the best in the world, and I think he must have read that wrong somewhere. but every government wants to be able to tell the people that they have great education. How do you do that? Well, you have a scale that comparatively measures Britain's education system, against India's education system, against America's education system, against Qatar's education system, against Nigeria's education system, and you put the best ones, South Korea, Japan, you put the best ones on top and the worst ones on the bottom. And the further up that league table you are, the better it is politically. Now, educators are very unwilling to give this up. Very unwilling to give this up. Because if they start to do something else with education, then they fall off this league table, because you can't compare. There are specific rubrics of how you compare education. And so it's important that Rishi Sunak, regardless of whether he was right about that, and by the way, he wasn't, but regardless of whether he was right about that, it's very important that he can say the British education system is up there in the top 5% or something. Wherever it is, depending on which rubrics you use. But when you compare it against other countries, if you change the education system radically, it's difficult to do that. So there needs to be a gradual change and a mindful change so that we can incorporate AI into the education system to help those of us who are neurodivergent, and yet to not appear to give such a radical change in the way that we educate and the way that we test and measure the education, so that politicians get scared, quite frankly. You've got schools, you've got local education authorities, you've got education bodies, you've got the government, and then you've got the international league tables. There are steps between all of these levels, as it were.
Exciting possibilities lie ahead, actually.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Is there any question from any audience? No, someone is introduced. Anjali Pillai. So, Anjali, if you have any question, please ask Martin. We have about 4 minutes time left. Actually, I have done something wrong, Martin. I told everybody that we're going to start it at 2 o'clock London time and 6:30 Indian time. But when I create the broadcast link, I did it something. I made a mistake. It was 3 o'clock London time and 30 Indian time. So now many people are joining that we are already almost finished. Almost we are done.
Anjali, can I ask you a question? Actually, thank you. You've just arrived, and you say you're from India. Can you remember in the recent elections in India whether people like Modi was valuing the education system, saying, "Look, we've got a great education system"? And Kavita, does AI operate in all languages? Well, this is a really interesting question. You cannot separate a language from a culture. So where it's programmed in English and it's not programmed in Urdu, or it's not programmed in one of the local languages of Kenya or Nigeria, then it can only translate, and it has to have a deep learning model to be able to translate. And by the way, when we say deep learning here, what we mean is generally 3 levels of neural networks operating at the same time. So does it operate in all languages? It can, but that doesn't mean it really understands these languages. A very simple example. There's one of my favorite examples. There's a word in English, eccentric. Now, This word exists in German as well, eccentric, exactly the same word. And it means exactly the same. It has exactly the same meaning. It is outside the center. In England, everybody loves being thought of as eccentric because it's kind of wacky and cool. In Germany, everybody hates being thought of as eccentric because it's kind of different and weird. And so you can use the same words and you can translate words, but that doesn't mean you're translating culture. And that's a really interesting challenge for AI.
She has just joined. That is why this question, I'm sure.
Beautiful question, Anjali. It can, but we need to be careful about how we program AI and who programs AI. It needs to be collegiate and it needs to be universal in order to avoid prejudice and bias, because there's so much prejudice and bias already inherent within artificial intelligence, and we need to be able to smooth those prejudices out. So, for instance, Anjali, I if I pronounced your name correctly, I hope I have. Anjali, we discussed earlier that AI has a particular hierarchy of what it sees as human, an actual human being, how it recognizes faces. And I, as a white male, am recognized as human better than you are as a non-white female. And this is something that we've got to really, really be very careful of, because these prejudices are ingrained, and even one tiny prejudice can have big knock-on effects. And by the way, they treat people as slightly less than other people, which is in itself an ethical problem.
Yeah, true. Thank you very much, Martin, for sharing your expertise and vision with us today. So it's 1 hour has passed, but I really didn't feel it.
I
And it
didn't.
was such enriching session from your end. Thank you very much. And Kavita Sharma is commenting here. Kavita Sharma is a very renowned inclusion specialist in India. So this afternoon, she sent me a link to an article. I'm sharing the link here.
Excellent.
So, and I will share it with you personally as well. If you could just go go through, go through it. So it was nice article. I jotted down a few points from that article as well, but I really do not have much time to discuss about it. So it's better if all of us can read it once, and maybe again we will have one more session with more people, and even Anjali, Kavita, Caroline, Rachna, who all are watching us today, listening to us today. Maybe all of us will join together to discuss about it.
I'd love to, and perhaps once Professor Lemke and I and Niels and others have and Florian have published our upcoming paper, we could discuss the effect that it has on dyslexic people, and we can extrapolate other neurodivergent people.
And I would love to read your paper, Martin. Please share the link with me. And if I have to buy it, I will do that. But I would love to read your paper.
We don't know whether it's being published, but if it is, the place where we want to publish it, it shouldn't cost money. It should be free.
All right. So thank you very much, Martin, for your time. It's Friday afternoon, and I'm sure you're working as well. Are you?
Always. There might be a moment when I'm not.
Yeah, thanks very much, Martin, for your time, and would love to have you once again very soon in this program. Let's Talk Inclusion, and would love to have your team from Beyond Inclusion as well.
We would be more than honored. We were talking about it, and it would be a genuine pleasure for us.
Thank you. So before we sign off, any concluding advice for our viewers?
Yes. I think what we need to do is we need to be careful with AI. We need to accept it and embrace it, but carefully. And we need to just be mindful of the kind of biases that are inherent in there. As I said, the very simple bias that AI in education can help bring neurodivergent students up to the standard. This is a neuronormative standard. Is this perhaps fair? That kind of thing. What does AI do in terms of using it for recruitment, or using it for healthcare provision, or using it for advertising and marketing? Is it creating widening inequalities? So I think we have to use it. We can't avoid it. It's like pollution in the air already. We can't avoid it. But what we need to do is just be very careful, and we need to keep speaking about it, because the more we speak about it, the more these issues are raised, and the more they are raised, the more the creators of AI become aware of them.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Martin. Thanks a lot. And with that, we conclude the 64th episode of Let's Talk Inclusion. Thank you to our viewers for making this series as the longest running series on Facebook on inclusion. I will come back with the 65th episode soon. Till then, take care and goodbye. Thanks very much once again, Martin. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.